Okay, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome to the World Water Week online session across borders, a global synthesis of latest WASH research. I'm Mitzi Borromeo, your moderator for this online session, convened by Asian Development Bank Institute, University of Virginia Batten School, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University. I think we're still getting in some guests, so we can begin, and we have a short introduction while we wait for others to come in. All right. In this session, we will explore new evidence from collaborative research between economists, researchers from other disciplines, as well as practitioners in the field to provide a roadmap for sustainable investment in water, sanitation and hygiene, or WASH services. By synthesizing findings from 3 special journal issues, we'll look into critical factors that effective and sustainable solutions need to address. As you know, it's quite a challenge to have a common language between economics researchers and WASH stakeholders. So we really need to communicate better to ensure academic findings and learnings are brought to decision makers, understood and discussed. So ultimately, our goal is for this knowledge and understanding to empower stakeholders to engage in more effective WASH cooperation and to ensure a peaceful and sustainable future for all, which after all is the theme of this World Water Week. Let's watch this short video clip.
Despite the progress that the global community has made in bringing clean water, safe sanitation, and basic hygiene to developing nations, we're still off track in meeting Sustainable Development Goal 6 by 2030. In developing Asian countries, more than 1.5 billion people lack access to modern sanitation, and around 80% of wastewater is discharged untreated, posing a threat to both human life and the environment's well-being. And in the face of the current global pandemic, the need for investments in water and sanitation has become even more urgent.
All right, that was an excerpt from an ADBI video from 2022 on citywide inclusive sanitation, bringing together insights on good practices in water and sanitation investment. So 2 years ago, but still very relevant today. And as we know, there are a lot of challenges from the pandemic that we're still recovering from now. So at this point, I'd like to do a quick poll just to see also how we've been doing from the point of the pandemic. So the question is, have WASH interventions in your region or your country improved in the last 4 years? So once again, this is taking off from the video, right? Thinking of how the challenges have affected WASH interventions in your country. The options are yes, there have been some improvements. No, they've gotten worse. Same, no significant improvements, or unsure. All right, while waiting for all of you to click on your answers, we hope everyone can answer that. We thank you for taking time to do so. Let me very briefly remind you of some house rules. You saw them flashed earlier before the program started. I'll just remind you to please mute your mic while others are speaking. And for our speakers, please do unmute yourself and turn on your video when you are speaking. Okay, I think we have about everybody. Yes, so everybody has answered the poll. Thank you very much. It seems the number one answer from all of you is same, no significant improvement, so status quo. And the second option is yes, there have been some improvements. All right, so basically they've stayed the same. Thank you very much. Thank you for answering the poll and sharing some context from where you're all coming from. All right, now, again, going back to the house rules, if you do have questions while our speakers are sharing some of their insights, please do send them in the chat box. You might have some comments as well. Please note also that this entire session is being recorded. All right, now let's move on to our first speaker. Let me introduce Dr. Molly Lipscomb, Associate Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at University of Virginia. Her research focuses primarily on environmental issues in developing countries and adaptation to lack of centralized health and sanitation services. Molly is co-editor of articles on sanitation and development published in the special issue of the prestigious Journal of Development Economics. Over to you, Molly.
Hi, thanks so much. So as the video showed, there's a stark need for improved sanitation, and this audience needs no convincing of that, I'm sure. So why is there this strong need for improved sanitation when it's a good that most people would want in their homes? Well, household demand is low because there's strong externalities in sanitation. So this means that neighbors are affected by your use of sanitation. And so you're not going to invest in quite as much sanitation as you optimally would for society because you don't get the full benefits yourself. So should this be a public good that's fully provided by the government? Well, certainly in most wealthy countries, it already is. But there are so many funding priorities in developing countries that it's really difficult to do this. A lot of money is already spent on sanitation investments worldwide. So the World Bank estimates that about $20 billion is required per year on sanitation, and the costs are very high. So we need a lot more information on what works and what the payoffs are to sanitation improvements. So that's why we were interested in putting together this special issue on sanitation in the Journal of Development Economics, because there's a strong need for more empirical evidence on what works in sanitation investments and why, what we can do to improve the way we're already investing each dollar that's spent on sanitation. So this special issue sets out to contribute to the literature by putting together empirically strong studies that help us to understand what does and does not work and why or why not. So you can see in the slide that's up that the countries from which this issue provides evidence on sanitation interventions and whether the evidence is on the supply side or the providers of sanitation, the demand side, so the households, or on welfare implications from the interventions. So we might be interested in terms of the welfare implications because it affects how we think about cost benefit reasons for investing in sanitation. So the primary thing there we might think about is the health impacts. So there's two really key papers that I want to highlight on the health impacts. One is Cameron et al. 2023, which provides evidence from 3 countries to suggest that there must be at least 50% coverage of improved sanitation in order to start achieving incremental gains from added sanitation. So we need at least a basic level of sanitation to start getting improvements. And then Deutschman et al. Shows that privatization of treatment, so interventions on the supply side where the government really can make a difference, can have huge impacts on improved sanitation. So those papers, the authors of those papers are both online today, and so they'll talk more about those. There's also non-traditional outcomes where Kresh et al. Shows that tax receipts increase when the government provides more sanitation services. So households really do appreciate improved sanitation, and they do credit the government with that benefit. And he'll talk more about that paper today as well. And then there are also returns to families that invest in sanitation on the marriage market, as shown by Augsburg et al. 2023. So economists often find it useful to put together a framework to think about how sanitation investments or different types of incentives can work together to create problems and then how we might go about fixing them. So together with Britta Augsburg, Andrew Foster, and Terence Johnson, we put together a model to better understand why interventions in sanitation have such varied success. So the model is elaborated in a summary article in the issue, but just to give you a little background, the model starts from the fact that governments and households each have separate priorities and both value sanitation as well as other things. But each wants the other then to invest more in sanitation because they want the other to invest in it so they don't have to. So this is going to lead to the fact that in isolation, both the government and the households would invest more in sanitation. But when the government starts investing in sanitation, the household is going to redirect some of the money that they otherwise would spend on sanitation towards other things. So why are they doing this? Well, the government is now providing some basic sanitation. The household is going to say, well, now I can use the money I would have spent on that to purchase other things. We're going to call this crowd out. So why is this a problem? Well, if we intervene and provide some basic services, we're going to find that the actual increase in sanitation is less than what the government or the NGO is actually paying for. And that's because the household is then responding by directing some of the funds it would have spent on sanitation to other things. So projects that should have had large impacts on improved sanitation are actually not going to do as much as hoped. So what does this mean for how we design policies? Well, it means that financial incentives can help, but often less than we might hope. And in-kind transfers are often going to be particularly disappointing in terms of redirection of the household spending. So the key takeaway that I think we can take from this special issue is that many countries are going to encounter similar issues in terms of the lack of take-up and lower than expected effectiveness of sanitation interventions. Yet the potential welfare implications of sanitation interventions are extremely high. And this is especially true since sanitation is a good that impacts the entire neighborhood. So it's of key importance, and that means that improvements must address many issues. So low demand may be both a problem of lack of information and other things like credit constraints. Governments are going to need to take into account the fact that households are going to adapt to changes in policy by changing their own levels of investment. And so this might mean that we need a big push in sanitation in order to have lasting progress. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Molly, and congratulations on helping put together this great special issue. And congratulations to all the authors. We'll be hearing more about some of these studies later on. Now let's hear from Dr. Dil Rahut, who is Vice Chair of Research and Senior Research Fellow at ADBI. He specializes in development, microeconomics, agricultural economics, and environmental and natural resource economics, with experiments and field research in agriculture, natural resources, and climate in Asia. He has published over 130 papers and lectures on development economics in Japan. Dil is co-editor of articles on WASH technologies and governance in urban development, published in a special issue of the journal Environment and Planning B. Over to you, Dil.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michi. Good evening to everyone. Good morning to some of you, and good afternoon. As Molly has clearly highlighted how important the WASH practices are, and the need for investment in WASH practice. I will just give you a background on why we actually conceptualize this idea about going for a special issue with environment and planning on WASH. If you look at globally, 2 billion people don't have access to safe drinking water. That's a huge number, and 3.6 billion people don't have safe sanitations in their household, and 2.6 billion lack basic hygiene practices, and 500 million children still lacks basic wash services. It's a very, very significant number of people that are being impacted by the lack of sanitations, clean water, and hygiene facilities. And you can see that the SDG 6 also has clearly emphasized the importance of providing access to wash facilities. As Molly has clearly pointed out, that having wash facility would have significant impact on the health and well-being of large number of populations. Next slide, please. Can we go to, yeah. So in this special issue, we have got 9 papers and in 4 themes. One is using household data. The other one is digital tools and remote sensing. The third one is covers governance, policies, and management issues. And the 4th themes cover improving water quality using schedule desludging. Next. Next slide, please. Yes. So if you look at this article by Cobron, it emphasizes that there is an urgent need for improving access to wash facility, particularly for the vulnerable and the poor people living in the developing countries. And also it also cites from Mukuru slums in Nairobi, where community involvement as a citizen scientist led to documenting water points, toilets, and issues like waste and flooding. This data empowered local women to sue governments for failing to provide basic sanitations. This case clearly demonstrates that the community-led initiatives can drive effective, context-sensitive solutions and build resilience. This is in line with what Molly pointed out, because is it a public goods or a private goods? So taking into account that, it's very important that the community acts together and put pressures to bring about changes in the community on sanitations. The first articles, which covers improved water quality and schedule desludging, it studies the impact of desludging on quality of waters and wastewater in Y City, India. It's by Jaswal ETL 2022. It examines how schedule sludgings affect water quality in drains, rivers, and groundwater. The study finds that regular desludging improves septic tank performance and reduces facial colifer concentrations in water sources, indicating ongoing benefit from these interventions. Next. On the use of household data, we have two papers, which uses household survey data to understand the wash behavior, household choice of sanitations infrastructures, and impact on diseases in India by Tiwari. It explored how income, cultures, and other factors influences toilet choice and health outcome in India. The second one is on household expenditure and accessibility on water in urban India by Tirumala and Tiwari. It analyzes how income and family size affects water cost in urban India, suggesting improvement in water supplies. Now you have seen that there is also new improvement in digital tools and remote sensing, and these two study uses digital tool and remote sensing to understand wash facilities. So the first paper is about tools for comprehensive assessment of public health risks associated with limited sanitation provisions. It uses the new technology in Kampala to identify health hazard and facial weight sources for targeted interventions. The second paper is from Bangladesh, Dhaka. It predicts housing deprivations from space in slums of Dhaka. It uses remote sensing and survey data to predict deprivations of sanitation facility, thereby enabling the policymakers to target their interventions. Next slide. On the governance, policies, and management, we have 4 papers. One is from Indonesia, the other one from Japan, India. So these 4 papers actually looks into the aspects of governance. It talks about developing strategies for climate resilient sanitation practices in Indonesia. The second paper actually uses STPA to identify risks and proposes government improvement in Japan facial sludge management system, offering insight for other countries. The other studies in Delhi, it investigates why sanitation outcomes vary across poor communities in Delhi, revealing biasness and political factors that affects access and service quality. The fourth paper creates criteria for selecting between shared and non-shared sanitation system using catalog to guide planners based on local context and needs. So these 4 are very important papers which actually highlights the governance and management practices. So final thoughts. This paper focuses on 3 outcomes of 5 development indicators under SDGs accelerated framework. That's data, information, innovations, and governance. It's necessary to use innovative tools and analysis methods to complement conventional WAS data generations. The papers also highlight the complexity of WAS provisioning is not simple and straightforward. Therefore, it's very complex and needs very, very detailed, well understood policy designs for technological advancement and implements. Lastly, several papers also have mentioned the lack of benefits for stakeholders and the needs for co-design and engagements of different stakeholders for policies and solutions. Next, please. Next, yes. So the key takeaway from this special issue is that we need to strengthen community participations. Without community participating into this WASH facility, it's very, very difficult to achieve the goals. And we need to adopt very holistic sanitation approaches. We need to develop better matrices and address inequalities. We also need to utilize innovative tools and also improve accountability and governance, and enhance WASH policies and governance, and expand scheduled dislodging. Thank you very much. I yield back to Mitzi.
Thank you very much, Dil. Excellent points there. And congratulations as well for co-editing this milestone special issue. A lot of interesting studies there addressing this wicked problem in sanitation, and we'll be discussing that with some of the authors now in the next portion of this session. All right, so let me first introduce our brilliant speakers, authors from these special issues who are joining us from different parts of the world. We have Bansi Malde, Research Fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Raymond Gutierrez, Associate Professor of Agricultural and Resource Economics at North Carolina State University, Manisha Shah, Professor of Public Policy at the University of California, Anna Thompson, Affiliated Researcher at the Institute for International Economic Studies, Stockholm University, Andreas Menzel, Assistant Professor at the Center for Economic Research and Graduate Education, Economics Institute, Joshua Deutschman, Evidence Synthesis and Research Lead of the Development Innovation Lab at the University of Chicago, Evan Kresh, Associate Professor at Oberlin College and Conservatory, Jigisha Jaiswal, Senior Research Associate at the Center for Water and Sanitation, CEPT University, and Antonella Bancalari, Senior Research Economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. We have quite a rock star panel here, so we hope to hear, we know we're going to run out of time, but we'll definitely have a very interesting conversation. I'd just like to remind everybody that if you do have questions as our speakers share their thoughts and insights, please do type them into the chat box, and we ask you to please do write your name, your institution, and to whom the question is directed to. So let's begin with Bansi. Bansi, I'll start with you. We heard about some constraints, different constraints that both Molly and Dil talked about in addressing the sanitation, the complex issue of sanitation. Your article entitled Labeled Loans and Human Capital Investments focuses specifically on credit constraints based on a study conducted in rural India. Do microcredit loans make government subsidy programs more effective? And how can households be supported better in paying for toilets?
Okay, thank you, Mitzi. So as you said, and as Molly said, toilets are very expensive, and households usually don't have the upfront funds required for the outlay. And so microcredit, these small loans that are often offered without collateral, offer one financing option. And in my study in rural India, we study whether these loans that are linked with sanitation through name only can be effective or not. We do see that microcredit loans, these sanitation labeled loans, are taken up by 20% of clients of a large microcredit institution, and they do increase the take-up of toilets. And unfortunately, that conversion of loans to toilets is not perfect, and some loans perhaps just displaced existing finance for toilets households are planning to construct, or were taken for some other purpose. But the primary reason we see for not converting these loans to toilets is that households still faced some financial constraints, so they still needed additional funding. So these types of credit constraints are really, really important in household decisions. What's more, the other interesting aspect, which speaks to the first question you asked me, is that these types of loan programs can actually support government subsidy programs, as was the case here in India, where under the Swachh Bharat Mission program, some households could access government subsidies, but only post-construction of a toilet. So for those households who are eligible for the subsidy, these loans supported them by providing them with that upfront financing needed to build the toilet to then get the subsidy, and also as a top-up to the subsidy so that they could construct more expensive toilets. For those households who couldn't access the subsidy, the loans actually gave them access to finance in order to construct the toilet. And combined, the loans then supported that government program in eradicating open defecation. But unfortunately, one point to note, though, is that in areas where there were delays in receiving these subsidies or toilets were especially expensive, we see that the subsidy eligible households don't all succeed in using their loans for toilets, which suggests that we need to ensure that government programs also function very well.
Thank you, Bansi. Very interesting how these different factors come into play. And there's also the role that gender plays into this. I'll ask you more about that later on in this discussion. So let's move on now to hear from some of the other, we'll hear from other authors. Let's go on to Raymond Gutierrez. Raymond, you study the combination of social and financial constraints. In fact, you provided social and financial incentives as part of your study. Your article is entitled Social and Financial Incentives for Overcoming a Collective Action Problem. Why did you decide to add this social angle?
Right. Well, thank you, and thanks everyone for joining. So we were studying the problem not so much of getting households to build toilets, but to keep them well maintained and use them regularly. And as you can imagine, this is a difficult thing to monitor. So we tested what you might call sort of a classic economist's prescription, which is incentivizing. We sort of showed up on an unannounced date and as best we could assess whether or not the household had maintained its toilet in a hygienic state and was using it, and gave them a small reward. And that was pretty effective in the short run. It turns out that the effects were not sustained over, say, the next year and a half. So as an alternative, we wanted to see essentially if communities could kind of police themselves. We present them with this problem and allow them to come up with their own ways to regulate or monitor. So we brought households together, and importantly in public, got them to sort of pledge to cooperate, to help each other, maybe pester each other a bit, etc. And then we kind of left it up to them how to do it. So this goes back to the tradition of Eleanor Ostrom in seeing what sort of organic institutions kind of arise, and that was also modestly successful, and stood up in the medium term. So let's say a year and a half. So we thought it's an interesting alternative in a case where it might be difficult to formally monitor, to raise tax money, to provide incentives, or to punish bad behavior. So that's why we did it.
Thank you very much, Raymond. I'll get back to you later with a follow-up question, because there were some findings that you saw that were different in terms of short-term and long-term incentives, right? So I'll get back to you on that. Let me bring in first Antonella. Antonella, your study emphasizes the importance of sustained adoption of health infrastructure. Would you explain what this means in the context of sanitation, and how do you define and measure continued community-based mobilization?
Thank you very much, Mitzi. Yes, so sustained adoption refers to the long-term use and maintenance of sanitation facilities after initial implementation. So in many cases, infrastructure is installed, but without ongoing community engagement, its use may decline over time. So continued community-based mobilization involves regular activities that reinforce the importance of sanitation, such as hygiene education, community meetings, and local leadership. We measure this through surveys assessing the frequency and quality of these activities, as well as through direct observations of sanitation practices in the communities, so the residents of the communities. And the primary objective of our study was to assess whether and how behavioral changes related to sanitation can be sustained over time. So for this, we focused on the Pakistan's national sanitation strategy, specifically the community-led total sanitation program, which aimed to combat open defecation. By conducting both a randomized controlled trial and a qualitative study, we sought to understand the long-term impacts of follow-up activities on maintaining improved sanitation practices after this initial push.
And what were the primary findings of this study? Maybe you can just talk about some of the highlights, one highlight.
Yes, so the study was motivated by the fact that there is an inherent difficulty in maintaining behavioral changes over time, especially in areas with limited infrastructure and resources for maintenance. And the initial intervention set a foundation, but without robust support systems and continuous engagement, the sustainability of those behaviors can be quite challenging. And so our findings indicate that the continued follow-up activities, which were based on this community-based mobilization campaign that I explained before, prevented slipping back into open defecation after the initial improvement. So, for example, in the province of Sindh in Pakistan, we find that in the control group, where no follow-up activity took place after the CLTS campaign, open defecation went from 26 up to 57 between baseline and control, which was a space of 2 years. So there was a reversal over time in open defecation. At the same time, in the treatment group, the one that was exposed to the follow-up activities, we find that OD was 16 percentage points lower in the treatment group compared to the control group in the space of these 2 years, so between baseline and endline, representing a 28% lower reversal to OD. And the OD results mirror the latrine usage effects, which we find was higher in the treatment group. The effects of our interventions were sustained over time for at least 1 year, which is what we're able to observe after the implementation of these follow-up activities. And we also find, interestingly, that the follow-up activities were particularly more effective in areas with initially poor public infrastructure and in households and for households that initially had low-quality sanitation facilities. So in such environments, the additional support and reinforcement provided by the community-based mobilization that followed after the initial CLTS campaign helped maintain some of the initial improvement and mitigated some of the challenges faced by the communities, leading to better maintenance of the latrines so that when they didn't collapse, that meant the households could continue using them and maintain kind of that sense of better community sanitation practices. So essentially, targeting efforts towards those facing more significant difficulties proved to be more impactful.
Thank you, Antonella. I think maybe later on we'll get back to these follow-up activities. It would be interesting to note how these also affected the results. Let's go over now to Manisha Shah. It's as we've been hearing from our different authors and our speakers earlier, it's clear that WASH adoption is suboptimal due to many constraints. So Manisha, even when many important constraints are addressed, finding health impacts is still quite rare in studies. What did you find in your study, which you write about in your article entitled "The Dirty Business of Eliminating Open Defecation, the Effect of Village Sanitation and Child Height from Field Experiments in 4 Countries"?
Thank you, Mitzi. I'm excited to be here and share some of these results. And so what we do in this study is we have 4 different randomized controlled trials across 4 different countries, India, Indonesia, Mali, and Tanzania. And we're studying the intervention of community-led total sanitation, CLTS, which is the same intervention that Antonella just talked about. The idea behind this approach is it tries to achieve behavioral change by this process of triggering people, right, leading to kind of pushing people to abandon open defecation practices and build toilets. And so the exciting piece of this study is we were able to implement a very similar intervention across all 4 countries. And these randomized controlled trials in some sense are at scale, right? In the sense that these interventions, they were implemented in partnership or by governments as part of larger national environmental health strategies. In all 4 of these countries, we do find that treatment is, leads to a higher probability of a household having its own private improved sanitation facility. And, these improvements range anywhere from 7 to 40 percentage point increase in having a toilet. We also find reductions in self-reported open defecation by similar amounts across country. But, as you mentioned, Mitzi, if we look kind of individually at each country, again, when we look at the health impacts of this treatment, we're finding pretty small impacts on child health. And in, places like India and Indonesia, we're finding like almost no impacts on child health. But because we have these 4 countries and because we have, a lot of variation in sanitation coverage across these 4 countries, and then we, in addition to sort of the randomized treatment happening in, across villages, what we're able to do is we're able to use this experimentally induced variation in village sanitation coverage to identify the causal relationship between community sanitation coverage and child health. Okay, and because we have these various countries with varying amounts of community coverage, we can do this estimation. And basically what, when we look at this kind of linearly in a linear specification, we estimate that going from no sanitation coverage to 100% coverage yields a 0.43 standard deviation increase in child height. And so that's pretty large. And so then what we do is we say, hey, let's look to see, are there threshold effects, right? Because in most cases, people are not going to be going from like 0 to 100% coverage. We've observed this all over the world with CLTS. And so what we find is there are these really important threshold effects. And so what we're finding is that after a village reaches about 50% coverage in sanitation, we're finding relatively large benefits to child health, right? So about 0.3 standard deviations improvement in child health after your village reaches about 50% coverage. And in fact, this child height health effect, it really persists until the village achieves near universal coverage. And so we're arguing that these results are actually suggesting that there's large health benefits to achieving around 50% coverage, but really, really limited to almost no effects if you're not getting to that minimum threshold. And a lot of this is basically because of this externality issue that Molly mentioned, in her introduction, in that even if I build a toilet in my house and all of my neighbors around me are still open defecating, my children are probably not going to observe health benefits because they're still being exposed, to feces or around my house. And so you need this kind of minimum level of coverage to start observing some of these health benefits. And that might be one of the reasons that, when you kind of look at countries individually, places, historically like India that have had lower rates of kind of village coverage, that might be the reason we haven't observed these big child health impacts that we've been expecting to find.
Thank you, Manisha. Definitely a lot of data there covering the different communities, but so important to look at all of that. Thank you. Let's go over now to Anna Thompson. Anna, we've talked a lot about lessons from research for practitioners and policymakers, but one big part of this is what research gets carried out in the first place. Your paper in the special issue entitled Transparency, Governance in Water and Sanitation, Experimental Evidence from Schools in Rural Bangladesh. This is a collaboration between your research team and practitioners at the Water Integrity Network. How did this come about?
So funnily enough, it's actually a World Water Week baby, the paper, because back in 2017, I was here to present results from another experiment that we'd run, where we basically studied what happened when you used consensus-based approaches to decision-making in rural water supply projects in Bangladesh. And there we'd found a really strong effect. And my co-author, Umabek, was there for the presentation, and he came up to me afterwards and told me about a really exciting transparency intervention that they were designing. It was basically a deliberative stakeholder workshop, which is kind of kicked off by getting everyone to fill out this community scorecard and aggregate up people's scores to kind of come to some kind of coherent picture of the state of affairs. And he was really excited about what he was doing. And then so we ended up talking and designing an experiment to evaluate whether or not that intervention actually changed things in schools in rural Bangladesh.
Awesome. The great things, the productivity that comes out of things like World Water Week, right? And just very quickly, so to talk about the takeaway from this study. So unfortunately, this one-off workshop you studied was only partially successful. It improved knowledge about WASH and institutional arrangements to manage WASH, but it did not improve sanitation provision or educational outcomes. So it's frustrating when research doesn't tell us, when research tells us what doesn't work rather than what does work. What else can we take away from a study like this?
Sure. So we thought a lot about this all the time, all through the process of designing the experiment, because we wanted to be able to say something about why it didn't work and how we might design things better in the future if in fact it didn't have the effects we were expecting. And so the piece of this that was really successful is that they'd really carefully designed this transparency intervention to get people to come together and talk in a really kind of sort of neutral, non-accusatory way about really sensitive things like corruption in the WASH sector. And that piece was really, really successful. And we actually see that not only do people, compliment this process and enjoy it, but they're more on the same page, even a year later on when they talk about the problems that their school communities face. But these one-off interventions, they're really enticing to policymakers because if they did change outcomes, they would be really cost-effective. But, in practice, it's not clear that it's really enough just to go in and do this one-off intervention. And in fact, what we see is that later on, they're less on the same page about solutions. It's almost as if this workshop generated tons of different ideas about how they might solve problems, but it didn't create the space for them to get to agreement about like a specific course of action. And then if you don't have any follow-up afterwards, well, there's nothing to hold people accountable to things that they say they will do. And like zooming out a bit to other literature, that's kind of a pattern. When these things work, it's because they have longer engagement and they have some accountability dimension as well. And sometimes they even, couple an intervention like ours, a transparency intervention with financial support so that you can really change, what kind of problems can be solved as well as the approach to solving problems. So kind of my takeaway in general is that, we should be trying to not just, throw in the towel when we see that something didn't quite work how we expected it to, but instead try and tease out what worked, what didn't work, and maybe use that to kind of loop back to design things better in the future.
Thank you, Anna. Great points. Yes, don't give up when we don't get what we find, right? Thank you for that. Now, let's move over to Andreas Menzel now. Perhaps a topic that's quite difficult to study. It hasn't gotten much attention, really. So this topic that's only recently gained attention is that of menstrual health management. Andreas, why did you decide to study this topic? And this is covered in your article entitled Improved Menstrual Health in the Workplace and RCT with Female Bangladeshi Garment Workers.
All right. Yeah, thanks for having me here. And just if you were wondering why as a man I'm talking about menstrual health, that's because my two female collaborators are not available for this event, unfortunately, today. But obviously, it's a very important topic. It affects half of the world's population, women, and estimates suggest that at least half of women around the world do not have access to safe, hygienic materials to manage their periods. There has been quite a bit of work in the development space on education outcomes and the effect of poor menstrual health management on education outcomes. A lot of rigorous studies that showed quite promising results, that providing better access to menstrual health materials can improve education outcomes for adolescent girls. But there's a comparative lack of evidence on working women, women that may be a little bit older, maybe in their 20s, who have a job. And we thought like there was like an obvious gap that should be studied. And on top of that, we were approached by managers and policymakers from the Bangladeshi garment sector with whom we had worked previously, and they brought the question to us. They knew we were interested in questions about like improving productivity and well-being of garment workers in countries like Bangladesh. And they said they had a list of topics they proposed us to study, and the topic number one was essentially menstrual health, because the majority of garment workers in Bangladesh, of which there are more than 4 million, are women. And so we researched a little bit more, and we found quite an active gray literature, a collection of NGO reports that suggested that indeed a lot of turnover and a lot of absenteeism among female garment workers in these large export factories in Bangladesh that produce like the t-shirts and the shirts that we all wear could be due, in fact, to poor menstrual health management. And so we designed this randomized field experiments in which we wanted to study whether one or both of two constraints hold back the access to better menstrual health materials, and that is financial constraints or information constraints. So
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Andreas. Definitely a topic that we should all be talking about. It's good to have you as a man talking about this. It means that the topic is out there, and we're sharing important research and insights on this. And because it, as you say, it is a very pressing problem, and women hold up half the sky, right? So thank you for bringing that study to us. Now let's go over to Josh Deutschman. Josh, we talked a lot about constraints that households face, and the special issue also covers broader issues like whether privatization of WASH can be beneficial. Would you tell us about the direct effects of privatization of the treatment centers on service provider productivity, as featured in your article, Privatization of Public Goods, Evidence from the Sanitation Sector in Senegal?
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for having me today. So I want to give just a tiny amount of context, which is that the market for sanitation in Senegal, the problem is not so much solving open defecation, but thinking more about how households empty their septic pits. And that choice has similar implications for public health, depending on where fecal waste ends up, whether it's in the local environment or whether it gets taken away to a treatment center. And so we studied this in Dakar, where there are 3 treatment centers that were built by the government, opened in around 2005. And as the city has grown very quickly, as many other cities have, the treatment centers very quickly became overcapacity. And so in order to maintain operations, despite being well over their design capacity, they really need regular and active maintenance. And what we could see is that the government office that was tasked with managing these stations was really not keeping up. And so that resulted in lots of closures and unpredictable hours. And that had lots of implications for how service providers, septic trucks could do their work. And so many of these septic trucks were not able to be very productive because they couldn't visit these treatment stations reliably. And so we collected and digitized a huge amount of data, covering every time a truck visited any of the 3 treatment centers over a 10-year period. And we study what happened after the government delegated management of these treatment stations to a private company. And what we see essentially is that the direct effects are enormous. After this private company took over the management, they were able to extend the operating hours, improve maintenance so that the stations were available more reliably. And this resulted in a huge increase in the productivity of sanitation service providers. So truck operators were able to do more jobs per day, and were more likely to work on weekends. And so this had a pretty tremendous impact on the productivity of service providers, as well as some important downstream impacts that I'm happy to talk about if we have time.
Thank you, Josh. Yes, I hope we can get to that later. Let me go over now to Evan. Evan Kresh. Evan, your study, Sanitation and Property Tax Compliance, Analyzing the Social Contract in Brazil, provides a different perspective of why governments should invest in sanitation, something many may not be aware of. Can you tell us more about what you discovered?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much, Mitzi, for having me this morning. So one thing that we see with our with my research team when we talk to lots of different sanitation and water companies across the world is that there's a real struggle to generate revenue to cover the cost of funding these services, whether it's because the tariff structure is not designed correctly or people are tapping the system. But for one reason or another, a lot of systems around the world are struggling with revenue generation. And when that happens, one thing that these companies could do if they're owned by the governments is to use tax revenue from that the government's rates to sort of offset those costs. Of course, the issue as it goes is that in these settings where these water and sanitation companies are struggling to generate revenue, the governments are also struggling to generate tax revenue as well. So in our setting in Manaus, tax compliance is about 60%. So about 60% of households actually pay their property taxes. That's on the higher end. So Jonathan Weigel, he has some work in Uganda where compliance is in the low single digits, pretty low. So it kind of spans the gamut. And so we're sort of interested in thinking about this next and thinking about this potential for either a vicious cycle or a virtuous cycle where people's experience with the sanitation, with their access to sanitation or water affects how they approach other government structures like property taxes. And this idea of sort of the social contract, the idea that you give taxes because you're willing to impart some of your income to the government because the government will give you services in exchange is not a new concept. And in fact, in the literature, there's a lot on schooling. So how people think about the quality of schooling and how that affects their view of whether they're going to pay their taxes, but not so much is done in the sanitation literature, which we think is kind of crazy given just how salient sanitation is. You use it every single day, probably multiple times a day. And so the exercise we were trying to do is to link these two big areas, thinking about sanitation services and property taxes, and to see, is there some sort of relationship? And so our setting is in Manaus in Brazil, where sanitation access is rather patchy. And this is not unique to Manaus, even in Brazil. In Recife, for example, sanitation is also patchy, where the households right next to each other, one might have access to the sewer network and one might not for reasons of geography or history or circumstance. There's no universalization of sanitation coverage. And so what we find is that households who do have access to the public sewer system are much more likely to pay their property tax bill. They're about 15 percentage points more likely to pay their bill compared to households who have only private latrines, and even greater than households who have basically no improved sanitation. There's people who are using open defecation in pits or sort of rivers. It's a pretty open city. And so more so than that, we find that these households that do have access to sanitation and are more likely to pay their property tax bills are also much more likely to have a positive view of government. So we ran a survey for a different project, but one thing we asked about was your view on government. And one thing we found is that people who are able to access the sanitation system think the government is doing better for them. They have a higher view. They think that the quality of government services is better, and they approve of what the government is doing. And so we think this sort of points to a really important mechanism that could potentially help in solving the situation of how do you increase access to sanitation. We need more revenue, and what we do is through taxes. And so there's potential if sanitation companies and governments work together to sort of target, if they want to target smartly, sort of areas where if we want to expand sanitation coverage, one place to start might be to do it in places where tax compliance is very low. And if you can get those people onto tax rolls, then you can generate more revenue, and that can sort of create this virtuous cycle where eventually you get you both local governments and sanitation companies being fiscally solvent.
Thank you, Evan. All right, so we'll hear now from our last speaker in the panel, Jigisha. In urban India, there are different sanitation systems, with smaller cities relying entirely on on-site systems. And it's a big challenge ensuring proper management of these systems. At CWAS, you work closely with city and state governments to enable them to provide safe and sustainable sanitation services. Would you tell us about the CWAS approach, combining action, research, training, and advocacy very briefly?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mitzi. I would just echo what Evan was just mentioning right now regarding sanitation tax, and I just have a case where, with the service of on-site sanitation and scheduled desludging, the people are actually paying sanitation tax to get the services. So just giving a brief overview, like generally when septic tanks are present, people just get it emptied only when they have it overflowed, which has its own environmental effects, hazards and all. So where we came up with an idea of schedule based desludging, which which is an approach where every septic tank gets desludged every 3 years as per the national norms. And two of the cities in India, in Maharashtra, they adopted this as a municipal service. So the service was inclusive, and as well as the most exciting part of it was that the service was also delivered by a private operator, but under a performance linked contract with the local governments. And this assured that there was a high quality of service provision from the local government to the households, as well as accountability and a defined work for the private operator. And to support this, the city also introduced sanitation tax, which supported the payment of the private operator, as well as this helped us in the equitable management, like the bigger properties paid higher property tax, and the sanitation tax would link to the property tax, so hence higher sanitation tax. Also, with this setup, the cities have now completed their one whole round of scheduled desludging, basically 3 years of desludging the septic tanks, and all the septic tanks are desludged in the city, and have now introduced the second round by themselves. And to understand the impact of this approach, we conducted an impact assessment of the services. Basically what the paper is talking about, and it talks about the positive impact which this regular desludging had on the performance of the septic tanks, which in turn led to improvement of the quality of the drain water which flows to the river water, and with period we are also expecting improvement in the quality of groundwater. So with this on-field implementation and the evidence of the impact, currently the state government of Maharashtra has now introduced a government resolution which asks its 400 local governments to also practice scheduled desludging, and the cities are now at various stages of implementing scheduled desludging. So in this way, Action Research has always supported us to conduct desk research, implement pilots, and scale it up at state level or at national level with key learnings which we had during our implementation. So that's it, Mitzi. Considering the time, I'll stop right now.
Thank you very much, Jagdish. I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions, but maybe some of our speakers can answer them briefly on the chat. Now, let me just go over to close with key takeaways. Let's call Dr. Sitaram, K.E. Sitaram. He is a senior consulting specialist at the Asian Development Bank Institute and visiting professor at the University of Tokyo. He also was, yes. Dr. Sitaram, go ahead.
I'm really excited that this 1 hour listening to all our speakers and panelists made me really go back almost 20 years when I first started to work on water and sanitation, and made me realize how crucial empirical research is to persuade policymakers, especially when they have to make very difficult and important decisions to allocate money and also to implement reforms. Today, we learned many things. We learned how innovative interventions will improve health, hygiene, but there are challenges for sustainability. We also learned how financial and social incentives can play a crucial role in promoting sanitation and hygiene investments. We also learned how targeted health investment will address specific barriers and can lead to better and positive outcomes, and also have broader impacts that require holistic approaches. The motivation for this two special issues actually came from a question that I asked: why top journals in development economics didn't publish so much on sanitation? A review paper that my colleague and we did at ADBI Institute a few years ago, we looked at top 12 journals, about 20,000 papers for the last 20 years, and we found that only 51 had focused on sanitation. We have turned the table on that. Now I'm very grateful that with the support of our editors and authors, we've done several interesting papers in these top journals of development economics and environment planning B. Let me close with my gratitude to the organizers, the Stockholm International Water Institute, The co-conveners for today's session, the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University, our colleagues at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and also at UVA Baton School. Let me thank you, Mitzi, for really chairing it and delivering it for the 1 full hour. And please join me to thank those behind the scene, Sam Turmedes and Natia Parekkalaswali, Cecilia Tsujimoto, and Ayun Jung. Thank you all. Good evening. Back to you, Mitzi.
Thank you, Dr. Sitharam, and thanks to all of you for joining us today for this very enriching discussion. We thank all our speakers who have joined us, and you can access all these articles at the links that will show in the chat box or on the screen. These are the links to the special journals where some of the authors have cited their articles. So you should be seeing that on your screen now. And we'd also like to invite you to have a look at some of ADBI's latest publications, Citywide Inclusive Sanitation, Aligning Investments with the Global Sanitation and Wastewater Goals, as well as Social Cultural Dimensions in Water Resources Management. So again, you can click on the QR codes on the screen or look at adb.org/publications. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Let's keep the discussions going. More power to all of you as you progress with your work. Enjoy the rest of World Water Week. Keep safe and well, everyone.